Hey everyone, welcome back to my shop. As you can see in front of me, I've got some mallets. I went a little overboard on making them. Some of them went well, others not so well. Uh, but here's my first one. I bought this one on Amazon some time ago. Uh, it's pretty good. It's hard maple. The handle's not so good, quite thin, doesn't really fit my hand too well. And I figured it was time I started making a couple for myself. So we'll get started with the first two. And I'll jump in here in a little bit and I'll tell you how to make yours better and show you where I went wrong. So for the first two mallets, I bought a CNC file off of the internet from Two Moose Designs. And it's really quite a nice little mallet. It calls for an 1/8 inch cutting bit that is 3/4 of an inch long for the cutting surface. But I didn't have that. I only had a 1/2 inch one. So I went ahead and used that. I could have cut thicker material than used a template routing bit, but I didn't want to. So I just went ahead and cut some 1/2 inch material, and I did one out of hickory and one out of walnut, because if you're going to make one, you might as well make two. I glued up the first one and followed the directions that came with it on a nice little PDF. I let it set up overnight, and then the next day I sanded it nice and smooth on my disc sander. Put a little chamfer on it with my router table and chamfer bit. So while the head of the mallet was drying, I grabbed the handle and I went to my vise, and I thought I'd use this as an opportunity to practice with my spoke shave. And it went okay, but because of the contour of the handle, you go with the grain to into the grain very quickly. So it didn't last very long, and I ended up just smoothing it out with my spindle sander. Once all the parts were complete, I threw some glue on it, I knocked the handle in, I put the wedge in, I cut it flush with my pull saw, sanded it smooth, and then I threw some linseed oil on it. It's nice, but it's too thin, and my wife likes it, so she can have this one. Now for whoop, I'm gonna smack a fly and hit myself in the head. Uh, For the second one to come off the CNC, I wanted it to be a bit more thicker. More thicker? For the handle, I wanted to make it a bit thicker, and so I had some scrap pieces of hickory. I cut them out on the bandsaw. I used a drill bit through the end to kind of register everything in the same place. I glued it all up, and then I cleaned it up with the template bit on the router table. For the head, the mallet head, I had some 3/4 inch spalted maple, and so I used the same CNC plans, and I just cut some thicker pieces. And then it was the same again for the assembly. I sanded up the mallet head on the disc sander, I threw some glue on it, and put the handle in and knocked the wedge in. Once it was dry, I used my pull saw, cleaned up the top, sanded it all up, and put some linseed oil on it. So far, I like this mallet the most. I like the handle. It's about 1 inch thick, which really suits my hand. The problem with it is the handle itself. It's set up for only using one side of the mallet. You can flip it around, and actually your hand does kind of fit in there okay, but it's really set up just to use the one side. So I'm going to make another one, not using the CNC. Another thing about this one, compared to the Amazon one, this one is slightly heavier, but this one feels heavier because I think all the weight is in the head, because the handle itself is only about 1/2 inch thick. With the weight kind of getting distributed through the whole thing, I think I'm going to make one a little bit larger in the head, so there's a bit more weight up there, but do a very similar size handle. So for my next one, I've got some chestnut oak here, which is a type of white oak. I've got the last remaining bit of the spalted maple, this big piece of hickory, and I'm going to use that for the handles. The dimensions of this mallet head are about 2.5 inches wide, 2.5 inches tall, and 4.5 inches wide. So I'm going to make one, I guess, 3 inches tall, 3 inches wide, and 5 inches long. See what kind of weight we get out of that. I've made two handles. They're about 1 inch thick, about 1.5 inches wide. I'll probably give it a bit of shape and really radius the corners, and I think that should fit my hand very nicely. I still need to cut them to length, but I put them in my tenon jig on my table saw, and I just cut a little shoulder. This is now 3/4 of an inch thick, and it's about 3 1/4 inches tall. Future Paul here. A little tip to make yours better. Put a shoulder on all 4 sides of the handle. That will hide any gaps in the mallet head, and it'll look a little bit cleaner. I cut the outside pieces of my mallet. They're about 1 inch thick, and I cut the inside piece as well. I set my chop saw to 3 degrees, and I put a cut right down the middle. So I'm just going to flip one piece, and that'll give me a taper. It's me again. This is where the mallet build starts going a bit wrong. I used 3 degree on that taper on the chop saw, and I really should have only used about 1 degree. That gives you just a little bit of a gap to fill when you put your wedge in there. And to be quite honest, I don't even know that you need a wedge in there. I think the glue is more than sufficient to hold it in place, but the wedge does look nice. So getting back to the handle, I put a line right down the middle. I'm going to drill a hole, maybe 3/4 of an inch up from the shoulder. I'm going to make it so it's going to taper out or spread apart about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm just going to draw lines and use my handsaw to cut that. Here's another spot where I went wrong. I used my bandsaw with a resaw blade to get that wedge shape started, and it came out very rough. I should have just used hand tools, my little pull saw here, and just gone as deep with it as I can reach with the pull saw. And this one's about 1.5 inches deep. I think that's plenty. So before I cut that 3 degree angle on my chop saw, I planed and sanded it so that it's the same height or thickness as the handle where I cut the shoulder. So I've got my wedge, I've got my little split here in the handle. I gave myself a little head start on the bandsaw. It was a resaw blade, so I'm not sure that was such a good idea, but I'm sure it'll still work. So while the glue is drying on the mallet head, I want to give the handle a little bit of shape. This one is really nice. The length is good, so I will start out by cutting it to the same length, which is 9 3/4 from the mallet head. I used a 1/4 round bit on the router table, and it fits pretty good in my hand, but it's still maybe just a little bit large, so I think I just want to give it maybe a little bit of an hourglass right where my hand would go. So I'm just going to mark where the top of my hand would go and the heel of my hand, and then just maybe bring it in a little bit with maybe my spoke shave again, play with those. The handle's done. I just finished it off with a 1/2 inch round bit, and it really feels good. So the mallet head still has to dry overnight, so I'm going to leave that there. And let's do one more mallet. I've got a big chunk of walnut here. I'm going to try and leave it as large as possible. The pith is going through it right there. So I'll just cut that out, square it up, and see how big I can keep it. I've got a line going down the center, and I've got my roughed out handle. I'm going to mark it out and then take it over to my mortiser and take out this area here. And my idea is that the dimensions of this with the wedge in it will match the dimensions of the inside of the mallet head perfectly. So I will knock it in there with the wedge in place, and it'll be permanent. That's the idea. I know it's raining outside, and you can stay in here if you behave. It's the next morning. We'll take a break from this ridiculous one and finish off this one. I used my chop saw to cut the ends off and just cleaned it up on the disc sander. I'm going to put it in the vise and just use my hand plane just to chamfer the edges a little bit. I was test fitting it as I was going along, but it was really tight. I knew I could hit it in with a mallet, but honestly, there's no reason why it had to be that tight, and I just knocked it in there. Keep an eye on the bottom of the mallet. You'll see the cracks start to form. I got a big gap. I'll have to make another little wedge. So a few things went wrong with this mallet. When I was pounding in the wedge, I cracked the handle. And what I should have done is maybe made a couple small wedges for either side of the handle and then the one in the middle. I think when I cut the 3-degree taper on the middle bit, that was just too much of a gap to fill. So I should have probably used 3 little wedges rather than just trying to fill that gap with one, which split the handle. I think what really went wrong with this project, I was rushing it. Midway through this video, I went to Wales to visit my family for a couple of weeks. I'm in Wales! Me trying to rush through projects is kind of an artifact of working on ships for the last 17 years. I'd be away from home 6 to 8 months out of the year, so my time at home was very limited, and I would tend to rush through projects to get them done, which is what I think I was doing here. I don't have that problem anymore, and what I should have done is just walked away and come back a bit later. Even though the handle's cracked, it feels like it's a nice weight, so I think I might make another one. But it's white oak, and I want to try using vinegar as a finish for it. I've been soaking some steel wool in vinegar for 4 or 5 days now, and I'm just going to put that through a strainer, and I'm going to put that on there to see how it looks. And this is how it ended up. On the oak, it looks kind of chalky and kind of brownish. On the hickory, it didn't look good. On the maple, it didn't look good, and that's probably because maple and hickory don't have much tannins in it. That makes the vinegar turn it black. Here's the replacement handle. I kept the groove for the wedge really thin this time. I went beyond the hole and I put another one there where the grain kind of goes to, because I'm pretty sure it's going to crack when I start hammering the wedge into it. That's better. And here's the replacement. I only put the vinegar on the white oak, nothing on the hickory handle except for the boiled linseed oil that I put on the head and to the handle. On the last couple versions of the mallet, I skipped the router table completely. I just used the spoke shape. I started to get a bit more of a feel for it, although the more shape I started putting into it, yeah, I started getting into the grain a bit more, which made me realize a better tool for it would have been a wood rasp. And of course I had one. I probably reached over it to get the spoke shape, but I forgot I had this. But spoke shape worked good. This is a 151 flat bottom from Stanley. I still finished up on the spindle sander and also used a sanding sponge. I've got my mortise saw cleaned out. The handle fits nice. This mallet was just for fun. I wanted to try the connection of the wedge in the handle in a mortise, and it weighs about 3.5 pounds. I don't think I'll ever use it. Somewhere out there's a key to a bathroom that probably needs this attached to it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button down below. Also consider subscribing. It really helps out my channel. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you next time.